Hello, welcome to Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Yinka Etade. Here are the stories making headlines across the continent. South Africa's communications minister defends his policy shift that would allow Elon Musk's Starlink to bypass the country's long-standing equity rules. The ruling ANC accusing Solly Malatsi of not consulting the party before making the change. The US is set to scale back its military presence in Africa. General Michael Langley calling on the continent to become more self-reliant. It comes as Islamist insurgency continues to gain ground, while Russia and China intensify their push for influence across the region. And it was once a key clog in the transatlantic slave trade, but today Ghana's Fort Prinzenstein is a shell of itself because of climate change. Activists are demanding the government take urgent action to save the UNESCO World Heritage Site. Thanks for joining us. South Africa's communications minister is standing firm. Solly Malatsi is insisting that the country is not relaxing its black economic empowerment laws for tech giants like Elon Musk's Starlink. It comes after backlash over policy changes he put forward that would allow communications companies like Starlink to bypass equity rules. The communications minister had been facing Parliament. He's been accused of not consulting the ANC before putting the draft policy out for debate. Tom Canetti is at the Parliament in Cape Town.
So the minister said the reason for this draft policy recommendation was to open up South Africa's market to companies like Starlink from the US, which he said has the best and most progressive technology in the sector at the moment. Obviously, what's prohibiting that from happening is black economic empowerment laws here, which one speaker backed up the minister, questioning the efficacy of those laws, saying that they only benefit a small few, noting an example of a 1 trillion rand being pumped into BE laws to only benefit about 100 people. But the heart of the debate was about sort of grilling the minister for not first off consulting the ANC before making this policy recommendation and being accused of succumbing to pressure from Washington to sort of rewrite South Africa's transformative laws without first of all consulting the right parties in South Africa first of all. Another speaker noted that the telecommunications industry is one of the least transformed since the transition to democracy in terms of black ownership. And another noted the national security potential threat by giving Elon Musk so much control over the sector, and giving the example of Musk sort of indirectly threatening to shut off Starlink on the Ukrainian front earlier this year. Now, the minister sort of ended this debate by saying that he will follow the right process and take any comments about the draft, the policy recommendation into consideration.
We're going to turn our focus to the US's plans to dial back its military presence in Africa now. Speaking at African Lion, the largest joint training exercise on the continent, General Michael Langley urged African nations to take the lead in their own security, calling for greater self-reliance in the face of growing threats. Well, the shift comes as Islamist insurgencies gain ground, while Russia and China intensify their push for influence across the region. Well, let's speak more on this and speak to Paul Melly, who's a consulting fellow for the Africa programme at Chatham House. Thanks so much for joining us on the programme, Paul. Good to see you.
Welcome.
Just give us some context first. Lay out for us how the US contributes to Africa's security.
Well, there have really been two dimensions, if you like, to the US support for security and stability across the African continent. One is directly military. And so there have been a number of locations, I think 6,500 American troops at the moment, stationed in various places across Africa. They were, for example, very prominently based with a big drones base in Niger in the Sahel with around up to 1,000 personnel there. And regular military training exercises, such as the one you just mentioned, African Lion, where they've worked with African armies to train troops on specific aspects, for example, the counterterrorism operations or whatever. But there's a wider dimension, which is that until now, the US has always made a very strong signal, if you like, of its support for Africa more generally through the development agencies, USAID, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, through a strong diplomatic engagement, big embassies, a strong tradition in the US State Department of diplomats with real knowledge of the region. And this has been bipartisan. So it's been not just Democrat presidents with their traditional appeal, if you like, to the African American electorate, but it's also been true with the Republicans. For example, George W. Bush with the PEPFAR initiative for crucial health initiative in the early 2000s. So that's been what the US has been doing up to now, but now we're seeing a change.
Yeah, we are seeing this worrying shift. Let's focus on the timing of all of this. As I said before, Islamist insurgency is expanding across the continent. You also have China launching training programs for African militaries, while Russian mercenaries are also trying to cement their role in Africa's security. Is this really the right time for the US to start to pull back, do you think?
Well, it feels like a very strange time because the Trump administration has made no secret of its concern about China's growing influence, growing power. And as you mentioned, the Chinese have launched a military training program in Africa. And that, of course, is complemented by their huge economic presence, both through the financing of major projects, bridges, railways, pipelines, and of course in the Chinese state system, very often projects that a Western company might find difficult to do, Chinese enterprises can do, but also through a growing Chinese small business presence, and now also complemented by this security presence. And the Chinese have a very active diplomacy. In September last year, there was the latest of the big regular Africa-China summits in Beijing, attracting very many of the continent's heads of state. And now we're also seeing Russia with mercenaries and with security companies under the control of the Kremlin, particularly present, again, in the Sahel countries, in Niger, in Mali, Burkina Faso, but also in the Central African Republic and elsewhere. I mean, the Russian presence, the Russian offer is mostly security plus mining. The Chinese offer is a much broader one. But in both cases, these are big global players reinforcing their presence. So it seems a very strange time for the US to rein back and to say that it's expecting African militaries to become more self-sufficient, particularly because some of the countries under most pressure are in some of the poorest parts of the continent. So it's a very strange decision.
And do we have any response from African officials? Have they responded to this news that the US could be pulling back and scaling back their presence?
They haven't really said very much at this stage, but it's quite an interesting contrast that just at this moment, the European Union has been stepping up its diplomatic overtures. Of course, the EU has a long-term strong involvement with Africa, but the EU's sales pitch, as it's like, if you like, the message that the EU is saying very explicitly is we're the reliable partner. So without making any comments about the US, the implication is that the US is becoming a country that can't quite be relied on. Now, African leaders, of course, will be very cautious about saying anything because there are still other important factors at stake. The US, of course, is a major voice in institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the UN, which are still so important for Africa. And there's a particular economic issue, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. This, again, is another of those bipartisan measures. It was designed to try and help African countries export goods into the US and therefore thus help their development, their job creation. With the Trump administration's much more nationalistic trade policy, that already looks very vulnerable. And countries such as Lesotho, in southern Africa, some of the poorest countries, risk being very badly affected. Madagascar is another country where huge numbers of jobs could be at risk. And so African countries will be reluctant to say anything critical in public. We've just seen the South African president have a really quite awkward diplomatic encounter with President Trump a few days ago in the White House, and they won't want to do anything that destabilizes those bits of the US relationship that are useful and positive, and that they think they can still conserve, and engagement that they can still keep. And for particularly AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, that's a really important factor in maintaining trade. And so they'll be very anxious not to offend the US, despite their private concerns perhaps about these defense and military issues.
Yeah, it's a hard balancing act that they're going to have to play there. Paul, really great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us on Eye on Africa today.
Yep.
Next, in Senegal, a political reckoning appears to be underway. President Bassirou Diomaye Faye, elected last year on an anti-corruption wave, is making good on his promise to clean house. Hidden debts exposed by the IMF and the Court of Auditors now push national debt to nearly 100% of the country's GDP. And in just 2 weeks, 3 ex-officials have been indicted by the High Court of Justice. Our correspondent in Dakar, Kayleen Kelly, reports.
Here in Senegal, anti-corruption measures are ramping up after the 5th official from the previous administration was charged by the High Court of Justice on Monday. Amadou Mansour Faye, a former minister and also brother-in-law of ex-president Macky Sall, was charged with embezzling over $4.6 million in public funds whilst he was acting as the former Minister for Community Development. This is the latest in a much broader crackdown on alleged corruption in the previous administration, the very same platform that Diomaye Faye was elected upon last year here in Senegal. Last week, the same Senegalese court indicted 2 other former officials for mismanagement and embezzlement of funds during the COVID-19 pandemic. This follows a parliamentary inquiry released earlier this year that revealed widespread misuse of public funds. The opposition say that these detentions are unjust and part of a villainous injustice system, they say. But the supporters of this current administration say that this ongoing crackdown is necessary.
Going to end the programme in the Ghanaian city of Keita because a key part of the country's history there is under threat from climate change. Fort Prinzenstein, which was once a grim clog in the transatlantic slave trade, is now a shell of itself because of rising sea levels, relentless erosion and human neglect. Activists are now urging the government to act fast to preserve the UNESCO World Heritage Site. Lauren Beshtika reports.
Perched on the Ghanaian coastline, the ruins of Fort Prinzenstein are hanging on by a thread. This former colonial stronghold, where slaves transited before being sent across the Atlantic, used to lie some 6 kilometers away from the coast. But today, waves have begun to eat away at its crumbling walls. Only 10% of the structure remains standing, and its caretaker, James Acorley, warns it could soon be entirely engulfed by the sea.
In 20 years to come, if it has not been restored, the whole thing will collapse, and our history will be no more.
Built by the Danish in the 18th century, the UNESCO World Heritage Site now attracts thousands of visitors each year, seeking to reconnect with their history.
We call them the site and place of memory. For many reasons, it is a touristical site, but it's also sacred, especially for those communities.
All along Ghana's coastline, dozens of forts and monuments are being threatened by erosion. 25 years ago, the government launched a vast seawall project meant to halt rising sea levels. But the scheme has severely impacted local communities, which heavily rely on fishing to earn a living.
Now, if you put up this structure, the first structure, you are protecting the coast anyway, but then you deprive the people of their livelihoods.
Beyond erosion, Fort Prinzenstein has also suffered from years of neglect. Local actors are now pleading with authorities to urgently restore the structure and help preserve its history.
Well, that's it from all of us on the Eye on Africa team. Thanks so much for your company, and do stay tuned. There's plenty more news up to come.
The population has doubled in the last 40 years. The impact is real. Overpopulation.
Life is tough. I'm a day worker. I sell bread from my cart.
Access to water.
We used to grow everything. Rice, sugarcane, but those fields have shrunk because of water shortages.
While some are exploiting the country's last resources.
It's a non-renewable resource, and it also belongs to future generations.
Others are trying to think ahead.
We try to challenge the idea that having more children means you're wealthy or well-regarded.
Many are worried about the future.
What will they do once I'm gone? Who will take my place? Only God can help them then.
Egypt's overpopulation crisis on France 24 and France24.com.